Canadian police are on the hunt for a missing woman. Though all indications suggest murder, they must rely on a single strand of animal hair to prove it. When an Ohio woman vanishes, suspicions swirl around her husband. What police lack is hard evidence. In Missouri, a man is found brutally murdered.
Doesn't look like it.
To catch his killer, police must piece together his final minutes. Sometimes, the murder suspect is immediately apparent, but the proof remains elusive. When there are no witnesses to speak for a victim, forensic scientists must transform the smallest clue into a material witness. Tucked away in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in the southeast corner of Canada lies the remote and sparsely populated Prince Edward Island. On October 7th, 1994, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, responded to a complaint about an abandoned vehicle found on private property. When the constable arrived, he discovered the car resting a few hundred yards off a private road. No tags were present.
41 to base.
A check on the vehicle identification number revealed it was registered to a woman named Shirley Duguay.
Number IG4, AB69.
Police arranged to have the vehicle impounded and then began trying to track down the owner. But when the woman failed to return their calls, detectives decided to go to her address. There, they were met by Shirley Duguay's father and her children's babysitter. The news of the abandoned car concerned them. Shirley, they said, had not been heard from in some time. The babysitter said that she last saw the 32-year-old mother of 5 4 days earlier. Shirley was leaving to run some errands. She never mentioned where she was going. She said goodbye and promised to be back in a few hours. For RCMP Inspector Alphonse McNeil, the story had raised a troubling question.
We wondered why they didn't report her missing. They said that they were concerned that an ex-common law spouse by the name of Douglas Beamish, who she had the three young children with, would end up getting the children if social services found out that she was missing or gone. So they tried to hold back that information as long as they could, hoping that they would find her.
For investigators, the time for waiting was over. Fearing that harm may have come to Shirley Duguay, police processed her abandoned vehicle for clues. What they found was not encouraging. Dozens of tiny reddish-brown stains tested positive for human blood. And barely visible blood-stain patterns found on the windshield and larger ones on the seats were consistent with having been caused by someone being punched or bludgeoned.
There was blood in the vehicle. Shirley Duguay had been missing for 4 days, so we were concerned that Shirley Duguay had met some form of demise in that vehicle.
Investigators returned to the area where the abandoned car had been found. For hours, the search for clues to the young woman's fate turned up nothing. Then, 500 meters from where the car was discovered, investigators found something. It was a pillow stained with what appeared to be blood. And a short distance away lay a blood-stained t-shirt. A shovel was also found nearby. all of the findings pointed to murder. And the shovel led police to believe that Shirley had likely been buried somewhere close by. But a thorough search failed to produce the victim's body. Now, police wanted to speak with the man who had the most to gain from her disappearance. Her ex-common-law husband and the father of 3 of her children. Doug Beamish admitted that he and Shirley's relationship had been troubled in the past. And he realized that her family probably blamed him for her disappearance. But he insisted he knew nothing about it. For the sake of the children, he and Shirley had managed to work out their problems. He said he last saw her a week or so earlier. He had been having car problems, and Shirley offered to give him a ride to a job site where he was employed as a construction worker. On the way there, they had a pleasant conversation about their kids and planned to speak more later. She then dropped him off at the site, and the two said goodbye. He hadn't heard from her since. Doug Beamish sensed that something was bothering Shirley. He speculated that she had left town to visit some friends in Toronto. But it turned out that no one there had heard from her in some time.
RCMP Inspector McNeil speaking.
Then, police got a call.
North End one?
A woman who had been following the case in the media believed she had important information.
This lady called and she said, I remember back around the time that Shirley Duguay went missing, I saw a car similar to hers on a road called the Allen Road, which would be about 20 kilometers away from where we found the car. I remember it was in the evening, it was dark. I saw 2 people on the side of the road, a tall man, a very small woman. They appeared to be arguing, and I just drove by, and I don't know if it's any good to you or not.
The woman couldn't be certain she had in fact seen Shirley Duguay. Still, the information was enough for police to search the area where the caller had seen the couple. But to cover the several square miles, they knew they needed help. Personnel from the Canadian Army agreed to participate in the search. For several days, their efforts turned up nothing. But then, they found something that seemed out of place.
One group came across a white plastic bag. We had a police officer with every group of searchers from the military. The police officer seized the bag.
The search of the area failed to produce any additional evidence. At the crime lab, examiners carefully removed the contents of the plastic bag. They recovered an old pair of white tennis shoes. There was also a large man's jacket stuffed inside. Several fibers and a single white hair were recovered. But further scrutiny revealed the presence of tiny stains that tested positive for human blood. Based on the information provided by the witness, police believed it had originated from Shirley Duguay. Now they needed to prove it. But there was a problem.
We didn't have Shirley Duguay, so we needed to be able to develop a DNA profile. The way we did that's what's called, in some cases, reverse paternity. We took a sample from her father, her brother, and her 2 sons.
Though everyone's DNA is unique, a genetic family resemblance exists among blood relatives. When the genetic profiles were compared, examiners concluded that the blood found on all of the evidence had originated from Shirley Duguay. Though the 32-year-old mother's whereabouts remained uncertain, all the evidence suggested she had been the victim of a violent crime. Police on Canada's Prince Edward Island continued searching for missing 32-year-old mother of 5, Shirley Duguay. Though efforts to find her had gone unsuccessful, authorities had found clues suggesting she had met with a violent fate. Among them was a man's jacket found stained with blood that had originated from Shirley. Looking for clues as to who might want to harm the young mother, officers from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police questioned Shirley's friends. They all believed that Shirley's ex-husband, Doug Beamish, was somehow involved in the disappearance. Recently, Shirley had started dating again. That had enraged her possessive and jealous ex-husband. And Doug Beamish had a history of violence.
When was the last time you saw those guys?
But the friend didn't recall if Beamish owned a jacket like the one found with Shirley's blood on it. Doug Beamish was emerging as the prime suspect in Shirley Duguay's disappearance.
Andre's down with the IN guys right now looking.
But so far, investigators had no physical evidence to prove it.
But, you know, without that jacket being able to tie it to someone we don't have much. Andre, how did you make out with
Then they got a break.
We've got something. Identitors came back. They found some white cat hair on the inside of the jacket. And all I could think about all the way down here was Beamish and his white cat in his house.
That was all RCMP Inspector Alphonse McNeil needed to hear.
We knew that he had a white cat and there were white hairs in the jacket. So the process then was to find a lab that could examine these if we were able to seize blood from the cat.
With a warrant in hand, police and a local veterinarian returned to Doug Beamish's house. The suspect continued to deny any involvement in Shirley's disappearance and claimed that he didn't own a jacket like the one stained with her blood. Though it seemed like a long shot, authorities took possession of his cat, Snowball, hopeful they could somehow establish a genetic link to the hair found on the blood-stained jacket. Blood and hair samples were collected from Beamish's cat. But now, investigators had to find someone who was an expert in analyzing cat DNA. At the National Cancer Institute in Frederick, Maryland, they found one. There, biologist Dr. Stephen O'Brien has looked to the feline genetic code for help in medical research. When contacted, he agreed to help Canadian police. But Dr. O'Brien and his team never imagined that by cracking the feline genetic code, they might also help crack a baffling criminal case. The request to match a cat's DNA was unique in medical and legal history. First, examiners generated a genetic profile of the white hair pulled from the bloody jacket. Once completed, the results were then compared to the profile generated from the samples taken from Snowball.
What we discovered was that the genotype was identical to what we had seen in the jacket hair. So we were pretty sure that the jacket hair had come from a cat which had the same genotype as Snowball.
Though the scientists felt confident about the results, they could not be absolutely certain of them. It was possible that the few thousand cats roaming on the isolated Prince Edward Island shared a common ancestry. To find out, biologists needed to generate more DNA profiles of other cats on the island.
We had to determine what the status of the population was so that we could make the calculation of how likely it was that we were wrong in pronouncing a match.
Examiners went to work developing the genetic profiles of 20 randomly selected cats on the island. When O'Brien compared the results, he found that none shared a DNA signature similar to Snowball's. In fact, the odds that the hair found on the jacket had not come from Beamish's cat were 45 million to 1.
Is that your socks?
Through Snowball, authorities had established a link between Doug Beamish and a jacket stained with his ex-wife's blood.
Your Doug will help you get up.
But Inspector Alphonse McNeil wasn't satisfied.
So you step out 1 foot at a time.
Next, he obtained a warrant to collect impressions of the suspect's feet.
Good. Just step out 1 foot at a time.
Now, he hoped to tie the suspect to the pair of white running shoes found with the jacket.
We thought, well, if we can put those running shoes on the feet of Douglas Beamish somehow, that would be pretty solid evidence besides his cat.
Dr. Keith Bettles, a forensic podiatrist, received the evidence. He began by creating plaster casts of the suspect's feet in order to reveal all of the unique characteristics.
People's feet are unique because we walk on them all the time. We have lots of different stresses, lots of different forces on our feet. Feet are practically as individual as fingerprints.
The casts of Beamish's feet lined up perfectly with all of the wear patterns observed on the insoles of the white shoes. A single strand of cat hair and a discarded pair of shoes had given investigators the evidence they needed to implicate Doug Beamish in the disappearance of his ex-common-law wife.
It was right down there. Just
Then, 7 months after Shirley Duguay went missing, badly decomposed human remains were discovered buried in a remote wooded area. Dental records later confirmed that the victim was Shirley Duguay. And the medical examiner classified her death as a homicide. A short while later, Douglas Beamish was placed under arrest and charged with first-degree murder. Investigators believe that Beamish couldn't handle Shirley Duguay dating other men. Somehow, he manipulated her into giving him a ride in her car and directed her to a remote spot. Once there, he beat his ex-common-law wife to death. He then buried her body in a remote area and abandoned the car. Douglas Beamish was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. No place is immune from violent crime. And even the friendliest towns have their problems. Mansfield, Ohio has been called one of America's most livable cities, which makes what happened here all the more surprising. On January 2nd, 1990, a woman came in to speak with Mansfield police.
Yes, ma'am. What can I do for you?
She was concerned that something had happened to her friend, 44-year-old Noreen Boyle. When she last saw her friend a few days earlier, Noreen was shaken and visibly upset.
Of course, I don't know why I must have been in denial.
Her marriage of more than 22 years was falling apart.
I just didn't want to know.
And not only was her husband moving nearly 200 miles away to Erie, Pennsylvania, but he would likely take the couple's 2 children with him.
The hospital, they said.
Noreen was devastated.
We had lunch together at Chinese.
When she tried to contact her, Noreen's husband, a prominent local physician, said Noreen had packed up and left town after a fight.
One time she said,
But the friend couldn't believe that Noreen would walk out on her 2 children.
which isn't right.
Mansfield police agreed to look into the case. And their first step was to question Noreen's husband, Dr. John Boyle. When Lieutenant David Messmore arrived at the residence, he learned that John Boyle was out of town.
Please have a seat and make yourself. May I offer you a...
John Boyle's mother explained that he had driven to Erie, Pennsylvania a few days earlier, where he was opening up his new medical practice. He was due back later that evening.
She just stormed out.
When questioned, she said that Noreen walked out on the family a few days earlier, and she was watching the couple's children until her son John returned home. woman excused herself to check on the Boyles' baby daughter. Then, the couple's son approached the detective.
Something like this. My mom would never do something like
He said he was afraid something bad had happened to his mother.
this to my sister.
But before he could explain, his grandmother returned.
I'm really sorry. I have no more information.
When she saw what was happening, she ended the interview and asked the detective to
I
leave.
really have nothing more to tell you. I really need to have you leave.
The encounter troubled police,
He's from Mansfield.
and Lieutenant Messmore couldn't ignore that Dr. Boyle had left town around the same time his wife was reported missing.
I'm not sure where it's at or.
But he soon learned that the reason for the doctor's trip to Pennsylvania checked out.
755-972. He had been hired by a very large medical corporation in Erie, Pennsylvania. So he was basically traveling back and forth between Mansfield and Erie for some period of time.
But where was Noreen Boyle? Later that evening, Detective Messmore returned to the residence. His visit had been anticipated. Dr. Boyle's lawyer answered the door.
You represent Dr. Boyle? I do. Oh, okay. Is he home right now?
Well,
His client had in fact returned home from Pennsylvania. But because of the strain caused by the impending divorce, Dr. Boyle did not wish to discuss Noreen with police.
All right, well, I'll get with you later.
It wasn't the response investigators expected.
I was somewhat stunned that in the event of a missing person in your family, you would hire an attorney to represent you when there's no accusations or even any allegations of wrongdoing or even criminal matters involving the family. So that was certainly a very unusual situation.
I was not the only nurse.
To find out what Dr. Boyle might be trying to hide, police questioned his friends and co-workers.
Started coming more frequently.
Professionally, all agreed Dr. Boyle had an impeccable reputation. But personally, he was known to be a womanizer and rumored to be involved in numerous affairs. In fact, one of his alleged mistresses was pregnant. And everyone speculated that the child belonged to Dr. Boyle. Though that made him a bad husband, it didn't mean he was capable of physical violence. In fact, only one person seemed to believe otherwise, and that was the Boyle son. Concerned for the child's well-being, Lieutenant Messmore caught up with him after school. The child was eager to tell his story. He said that the night before his mom disappeared, the sound of his parents arguing outside his bedroom woke him up.
I heard a big thump on the wall.
He heard a
And
loud
then my
thud,
dad came
and then there was
to the living room,
silence.
checking if I was sleeping.
A few seconds later, his dad peeked into his room. The boy was afraid and pretended to be asleep. The next morning, his mom was gone. His dad told him that she packed up and left. But he didn't believe his mom would leave without saying goodbye.
Did you have a conversation with your dad at all?
Though police had no evidence that a crime had been committed, they began to theorize that the noise heard by the child might have been the sound of his own mother being assaulted, or worse.
That's very unusual.
Police in Mansfield, Ohio continued their search for missing mother of two, Noreen Boyle. And now they theorized that her husband, Dr. John Boyle, was somehow involved. Though police had no hard evidence that a crime had taken place, they were able to obtain a warrant to search the Boyles' Ohio residence. Using luminol, a chemical that reacts to the proteins found in blood, technicians began scouring the house. but their efforts failed to turn up any evidence of a violent crime. Still, investigators persisted. To learn more, they contacted authorities in Erie, Pennsylvania, where Dr. Boyle was setting up his new medical practice.
Hi, Mill Creek Township Police Department.
Pennsylvania detectives tracked down a real estate agent there who had recently sold a house to Dr. Boyle and a pregnant woman who introduced herself as his wife. She recalled that Dr. Boyle was particularly interested in the home's concrete basement floor. He said he was eager to tear it up in order to build a playroom for his children. He offered to pay the asking price as long as he could take possession of the house immediately. The real estate agent turned over the sales agreement, which was signed by both the doctor and his wife. Pennsylvania authorities forwarded a copy to Mansfield Police Lieutenant David Messmore.
In that copy, it was noted that Dr. Boyle signed it, and also an N. Sherry Boyle. And checking further into the background, it was quite obvious that Noreen's name was not Sherry for a middle name.
Dr. Boyle had purchased the home with a woman pretending to be his wife. Investigators subpoenaed the suspect's most recent credit card statements. They learned that he had used his card to rent a jackhammer and to purchase indoor-outdoor carpeting and a load of concrete. Suddenly, all of the pieces were adding up.
I had the feeling and very strong suspicion that the body would be in that location.
Pennsylvania authorities issued a warrant to search the basement of Dr. Boyle's new home. Beneath some shelving and the indoor-outdoor carpeting, they found a badly poured patch of concrete. It was roughly the size of a makeshift grave. A crew was called in to dig up the concrete floor. After some time, they recognized the unmistakable smell of a decaying body. Then, a few feet down, they discovered a tarp. And inside were the badly decomposed remains of a human body. After carefully excavating the grave, the remains were transported to the medical examiner's office. A watch and other pieces of jewelry worn by the victim matched the description of those worn by Noreen Boyle. And dental records confirmed that the victim was, in fact, the 44-year-old mother of two. Noreen had been savagely murdered. On January 26, 1990, almost a month after his wife disappeared, Dr. John Boyle was arrested in Ohio for suspicion of killing Noreen. Despite the evidence against him, the doctor maintained his innocence.
Okay, sir.
Someone was trying to frame him. That seemed ridiculous to investigators. But to ensure a conviction, they needed an eyewitness or physical evidence directly linking him to the homicide. And so far, they had neither. It was possible that Dr. Boyle could get away with murder. But then, nearly a week after Dr. John Boyle's arrest, a Mansfield, Ohio resident made a strange discovery. A pile of concrete had been dumped on the remote property. The field was nearly 200 miles away from where Noreen Boyle's body had been unearthed. But the man had followed the case in the media and thought there might be a connection. A crime scene technician was dispatched to the scene. After photographing the area, the concrete was collected into evidence. Police later determined that the property was owned by a close friend of Dr. Boyle's. the doctor had been there on numerous occasions. But to prove murder, police now needed to show that the concrete found in Ohio had originated in the suspect's Pennsylvania home. Police had found missing 44-year-old Noreen Boyle buried in the basement of her husband's new Pennsylvania home. Though investigators had a strong circumstantial case against her husband, they hoped a pile of concrete found in an Ohio field could physically link him to the murder. The samples collected from the field, along with concrete taken from the crime scene, were sent to CTL Engineering in Columbus, Ohio. There, lab supervisor Larry Piscitelli is an expert in analyzing the microscopic nature of rocks and concrete. Without being told where the individual samples had come from, he was asked to determine if any of the concrete pieces had originated from the same source. To analyze the internal structure of the concrete, the samples are cut into cross-sectional pieces using a diamond-tipped saw. Once completed, the surfaces are smoothed and polished. Then, Piscitelli subjected the evidence to a high-powered microscope. Concrete is a mixture of stones, gravel, and sand, called aggregate, bound together by a cement paste and some trapped air. With the help of a computer, Piscitelli measures and counts each of these components. To the average eye, all concrete looks pretty much alike. But in fact, each chunk has a unique story.
Each piece of concrete is usually different because the components vary slightly. Even if they come from the same load of concrete, two different samples from the same truckload can be different because the percentages of the air voids, the small entrained or entrapped air voids, can be slightly different.
Piscitelli was unable to find significant similarities between most of the samples. But when he analyzed the results, he found that two of the pieces stood out from the rest. They shared the exact same number of unique components.
These two pieces of concrete had some unique characteristics that were peculiar just to those two pieces of concrete, and based on all the data and analysis, the numbers being exactly the same, I was able to show that those two pieces of concrete came from the same structure.
Of the two samples that matched, one had come from the pile of rubble found in Mansfield, Ohio. The other was collected in the basement of the suspect's new home in Erie, Pennsylvania. Police now had enough to charge Dr. John Boyle with murder. Police believe that John Boyle murdered his wife in the couple's home in order to start a new life with his pregnant mistress. After the kill, he drove her body to Pennsylvania and buried her in a grave he had dug in the basement of his new home. Investigators theorize he then returned to Ohio and dumped the leftover concrete on his friend's property. Dr. John Boyle was convicted of aggravated murder and abuse of a corpse. He was sentenced to 20 years to life. John Boyle thought he'd buried all evidence of his crime. But in fact, the trail of evidence spanned 200 miles. Other murders are more local, but the road to solving them can be just as long. In Harrison County, Missouri, on June 26, 1995, a farmer out for a walk noticed a foul odor. At first, he thought that maybe one of his livestock had died. But the reality was much worse. Hidden among some overgrowth lay the lifeless body of a man. After receiving the 911 call, dispatchers contacted officers of the Major Case Squad, a group of law enforcement personnel from several neighboring jurisdictions. Bethany Police Chief George Martz was among the first to respond to the scene.
We had no idea when we arrived who the victim was. There was no identification on the body that we were able to determine at that time.
But the manner in which he died was clear. He had been shot several times. Police recovered an empty box of ammunition. And a few feet away, they found several spent shotgun shell casings. Then, Sheriff Greg Kuhn from the nearby Grundy County Sheriff's Department arrived at the location. He believed he recognized the victim as a local resident by the name of Al Pinniger.
After I looked at the body, I felt that it might have been Al Pinniger, who I had dealt with in the past in Grundy County. Really couldn't tell for sure, but it just appeared to me that might be who it was.
Unsure what was evidence and what was roadside trash, investigators collected numerous items scattered around the area. They found and collected a small plastic clock. On the back was torn adhesive with tiny synthetic fibers clinging to it. They also located a single strand of brown leather lying in the middle of the road. Police hoped that somewhere among the debris were clues that could explain this brutal murder. At autopsy, the medical examiner confirmed that the victim had died as a result of several 12-gauge shotgun blasts. He'd been shot twice in the back and once in the face. The victim's fingerprints were lifted and then passed on to Harrison County Police. Investigators requested Al Pinniger's fingerprint card, which was on file in Grundy County. When they compared those prints with the ones taken from the homicide victim, they found a perfect match. Now, detectives from the Major Case Squad had to figure out who wanted Al Pinniger dead.
Major Case Squad.
Soon they got their first break.
Okay, when did she report him missing?
Police learned that the victim had been reported missing a few days before his body was discovered.
Okay, thanks for calling.
And the report had been filed by his fiancée. Police immediately arranged for an interview. The victim's fiancée told detectives that she and Al had been living together for some time. She said that she last saw him a few hours before he went missing.
Need anything from the store?
She had left the house to go run a few errands.
All right, see you later.
Al said he was going to cut the grass and do some work around the house. He hadn't mentioned any plans to leave that day.
5 days ago.
Recently, she had been trying to help him overcome a drug problem. He had been doing his best to stay far away from his drug-dealing friends. She suspected, however, that he had seen some of them that day. When she returned home later that afternoon, she passed a pickup truck coming out of her neighborhood. She didn't see Al in the truck, but she knew the vehicle belonged to a couple that he used to deal drugs with.
So he's been dealing with drugs?
She believed Al may have been ducking down to avoid being seen. When the fiancé arrived home, she discovered that Al and his 12-gauge shotgun were gone. The information provided police with their first real lead.
Okay, guys, here's what we got.
They ran a background check on the couple, identified as John Middleton and his girlfriend, Maggie Hodges.
decomposed. You and Rodney.
Middleton had an extensive criminal record, mostly involving drug-related offenses.
Get some information and come back and we'll...
To find out why he may have wanted to harm Al Pinniger, police tracked down Middleton's known associates. One informant described Middleton as an extremely unstable and violent person.
Hodges and Middleton.
He said that as a result of police efforts to crack down on local drug dealers, John Middleton had become increasingly paranoid. He threatened to kill people he did business with if he found out they were cooperating with authorities. No one doubted him for a minute. Everyone was afraid of him. All of the information led police to suspect that Middleton's paranoia had likely led to the murder of Al Pinniger. And they hoped that somewhere among the shotgun shells and the assorted litter collected from the crime scene was the means to prove it. Police in Harrison County, Missouri believed that a local drug dealer and his girlfriend were responsible for the brutal shotgun slaying of 29-year-old Alfred Pinniger. To prove it, investigators needed to physically link the suspects to the crime scene. Though several potential clues had been found there, an empty box of shotgun shells looked to be the most promising lead. A price sticker found on the box led investigators to the store where the ammo had originated. An employee there pulled recent sales records. According to receipts, several boxes of shells were bought on the day of the murder. The clerk recalled that 2 men and a woman had come in together to make the purchases. She also remembered something else. A few hours after the purchase, 2 of the 3 customers returned to the store. They had unused cartridges and wanted to return them for a refund. The clerk didn't recall seeing the other man who had been in with them earlier. When shown photographs, she picked out Al Pinniger, John Middleton, and Maggie Hodges as the 3 who bought the boxes of ammo earlier that day.
Did she come back the second time?
Yeah.
And she identified Middleton and Hodges as the 2 who came back to return the unused ammo. Though the evidence didn't prove murder, it was enough for police to obtain arrest warrants. Believing that Middleton and his girlfriend were capable of great violence, police cautiously approached the house they shared together. John Middleton was quickly subdued. Moments later, Maggie Hodges was also taken into custody. After the suspects were removed from the scene, police began searching for proof of murder. Inside Middleton's pickup truck, they collected a fringed brown leather jacket. As the search continued, technicians found a potential clue. Bethany Police Chief George Martz.
We took a piece of the dashboard from the Middleton truck that had a sticky substance on it, and on that sticky substance were fibers. Those fibers appeared to match the clock we found at the crime scene. So we removed a piece of the dash, the entire dash, and sent that to the lab for analysis.
All of the evidence was forwarded to the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab, located in Jefferson City. There, criminalist Kathleen Green worked the case. Almost immediately, she noticed that the fringes on the brown leather jacket appeared identical to a piece of brown leather found at the crime scene.
I looked at the jacket
to see if there was any fringe missing from it, and did find an area where there was a piece of fringe missing. I then compared the question end of the fringe to the question area on the jacket to determine if it was originally attached to it.
Though the pieces lined up well, Green was unable to conclusively state that the piece of leather had in fact come from Middleton's jacket. She turned her attention to the stick-on clock found near Al Pinniger's body. When she compared the adhesive on the back of the clock to the adhesive stuck to Middleton's dashboard, she found numerous similarities.
It was the same size, it had the same coloring, they were both made of the same type of material.
When the torn edges of the two pieces were placed side by side under a comparison microscope, examiners found a match. Next, fibers found on the stick-on clock were compared to carpet samples collected from the vehicle. Criminalist Jenny Smith found one consistency after another.
We determined that the fiber from the clock face, this would have been considered the question fiber, was similar in physical and chemical composition to the fiber from the suspect vehicle. Therefore, we would conclude that this fiber, question fiber, could have come from this vehicle.
When confronted with the evidence, Middleton was uncooperative.
This is your opportunity to tell your side of the story. We know what the story is.
But his resistance didn't matter. Police had pieced together the motive behind the murder.
Do you think about this real long?
My belief is that Mr. Middleton thought Alfred Pinniger was about to rat him out to the police department and to law enforcement authorities, and Mr. Middleton was not going to allow that to happen.
You're in some bad trouble.
But Middleton was wrong. The victim had made no attempt to contact authorities. Police believe that on the day of the murder, John Middleton and Maggie Hodges drove to Al Pinniger's house. They asked him to go target shooting, and he agreed. What he didn't know was that he was the intended target. At some point, however, that became clear. A scuffle started inside the car. Pinniger escaped, but he didn't get far. John Middleton was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Maggie Hodges pled guilty and was sentenced to 50 years in prison. It takes motive and opportunity to commit a murder. And it takes hard evidence to solve one. When clues are few, forensics experts provide the know-how to turn the most ordinary object into a material witness. In Montana, a murdered woman is found stuffed in the trunk of her car. With little physical evidence to go on, investigators struggle to catch her killer. A seemingly healthy 33-year-old woman dies in her sleep. Tennessee police must determine if her death resulted from natural causes or murder. In Ohio, a woman abandons her husband and 2 children. But a routine investigation reveals that her disappearance may not have been intentional. A well-executed homicide can baffle even the most skilled investigator. But forensic examiners look beyond the obvious to find proof of a killer's guilt and expose the elements of murder. Settled in the heart of Big Sky country, the city of Great Falls, Montana is surrounded by the majestic Rocky Mountains to its west and the Little Belt Mountains to its east. On an October morning, a man hiking along the secluded banks of the Missouri River stumbled upon several ID cards. They belonged to a young woman. Concerned, he alerted police. Deputies from the Cascade County Sheriff's Department responded to the call. At the river's edge, they found additional ID cards belonging to the woman.
Susan Galloway.
Police were familiar with the name. 27-year-old Susan Galloway had been reported missing the previous day. Unsure what to make of the findings, officers from the boat patrol were called in to drag the river. 20 feet from shore, they signaled they had snagged a woman's purse. Inside were more of the missing woman's ID and credit cards.
What'd you find?
There was also $100 in cash. But there were no signs of Susan Galloway. Cascade County Police contacted the missing woman's parents and brought them in for an interview. The family was alarmed when they discovered that their daughter and her vehicle were gone. Susan had recently become engaged, and she seemed so happy.
Would tell me anything.
Her fiancé, Craig Smith, was stationed at the nearby Air Force Base.
You did pretty good.
The couple often helped out at the business that the Galloways owned. Susan was a devout Mormon. And though Craig wasn't, he had agreed to convert so the two could marry. The family planned to give the couple ownership of the store as a wedding present. They couldn't understand why Susan would just take off without a word. Veteran detective Ken Anderson was not optimistic.
Well, finding the identification indicated that Susan Galloway did not, in fact, just leave town or drive away in her vehicle without saying goodbye and that sort of thing, because she certainly wouldn't have left her identification and money behind.
Police arranged to interview the missing woman's fiancé.
Hello, are you Craig Smith? Yes, sir.
Craig Smith had no idea where Susan could have gone. He last saw her the night before she disappeared. After leaving a dinner party, Susan dropped him off at his apartment around midnight. He hadn't heard from her since. The detective was curious about a bandage on Smith's hand.
What happened to your hand?
He explained that he had accidentally cut himself with a knife. A few hours after Susan dropped him off, he woke up thirsty. He tried to open a frozen can of orange juice, but was having trouble. He grabbed a knife, but it slipped as he tried to pry open the can. His car wasn't running, and he walked to the Air Force Base where he was stationed to have a medic treat the wound. Police later confirmed he had visited the medic that evening. The search for Susan Galloway was going nowhere. Three days later, a power company employee working at the Rainbow Dam spotted something on a hill across the river. He decided to go check it out. When he arrived at the spot, he found a car that had plunged down the hillside. The vehicle appeared to be caught up on some brush. Police and crime scene technicians were contacted and responded to the scene. A check on the vehicle's tags revealed the car was registered to missing 27-year-old Susan Galloway.
Watch for the evidence.
Sergeant Anderson made his way down the hill. Through the window, he observed a key in the ignition. There didn't appear to be anyone inside. But on the back of the vehicle, he noticed streaks of blood. There was also what appeared to be a footprint on the trunk. Then Anderson took a closer look inside the car.
The rear cushion of the back seat had pulled away from the trunk area, and at that point in time I could see a body inside the trunk of the car.
The woman matched the description of Susan Galloway, and it appeared she had been murdered. Police towed up the vehicle and began searching for clues. Inside the car, technicians found large blood smears on the front passenger seat. They also recovered several shards of broken green glass stained with blood. The exterior of the vehicle was thoroughly photographed. The victim's body was transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. The lack of evidence found near the car led police to believe that she had been murdered elsewhere and then brought to the hillside. A dog was brought in to track the victim's scent. A mile from the car, he alerted to a partially dug hole.
Sergeant Anderson, SNR 4, come on up. I think we have a crime scene.
More of the victim's blood was found. It appeared the suspect brought the woman to this spot, finished the kill, and then attempted to bury the victim, but for some reason gave up. The medical examiner confirmed the victim was in fact Susan Galloway. Pieces of green glass from a 16-ounce soda bottle were found embedded in her skull and neck. They had severed her carotid artery, and as a result, Susan had bled to death. Now, detectives had to find out who had murdered Susan Galloway and why. But with few clues and no obvious suspects, they knew it would not be easy. Police in Great Falls, Montana had few clues in the murder of 27-year-old Susan Galloway. The young woman had been brutally beaten with a soda bottle, placed in the trunk of her car, and then sent down a steep embankment. No usable prints were found on the glass or in the victim's vehicle. Hoping to identify a suspect, investigators released details of the crime through the media. A short while later, they got a tip.
He knocked on my door.
A man stationed at the local Air Force base believed he had information.
Asked me
About what time did he come to the room there?
He said that on the night Susan disappeared, he had seen her fiancé, Craig Smith.
about 2 in the morning.
Smith had come by the barracks in the early morning hours.
What's up? I was out with the guys.
He noticed his friend was carrying a bundle of dirty clothing.
I was out with some guys. What's wrong with your hand?
He also noticed a gash on Smith's hand.
Listen, man, I was out with a girl. And
Smith told him he had cut it with a knife. He was on his way to see the medic for treatment and asked his friend for a ride home after that was done. Smith had also told the airmen that he had been out drinking with friends and got stranded.
He had
In fact, he asked his friend to keep the story quiet because his fiancée, Susan Galloway, wouldn't have been happy about it. The airman's story contradicted Craig Smith's claim that on the night of the disappearance he had gone to bed soon after Susan had dropped him off. Sergeant Ken Anderson was suspicious.
It was almost as though Craig was lying about something, and all of a sudden he became the main suspect rather than the grieving fiancé.
Police looked to corroborate Smith's story. They located the medic who had bandaged his cut hand. He confirmed that Craig Smith had come in to be treated for a cut in the early morning hours of October 23rd. But the medic recalled thinking that the wound was consistent with having been caused by a jagged edge rather than a knife blade, as Smith suggested. Though incriminating, the information fell short of proving that Craig Smith was a killer. Now, looking to tie the suspect to the crime scene, police canvassed the nearby area.
I just have a couple questions for you, if you don't mind.
A clerk at a convenience store remembered seeing Smith and Susan Galloway the night she disappeared. And according to the clerk, they seemed to be arguing when they came into the store. They bought a few bottles of soda and then left.
We're going now.
The clerk showed the officer the type of soda purchased by the couple. They were 16-ounce bottles made of green glass, identical to the glass that had killed Susan Galloway. The information was enough for police to obtain a warrant to search Craig Smith's residence. The suspect continued to deny any involvement in Susan's death. He admitted he and Susan had been in the convenience store that night. And he also admitted that in the past, he had hung out at the area where her car was later found. But Smith denied ever being at the spot where the partially dug hole was found. The place police believe was the kill site. Detectives collected the clothing he wore on the night of Susan's disappearance.
Yes, that is.
But the items had been recently cleaned.
Is there a shirt in there also, Ken?
Police realized their only hope would be to link Smith to the sneaker print recovered from the trunk of Susan's car. They collected a single pair of muddy shoes. An examination revealed that the shoes seized from Craig Smith were the same size and the soles had the same pattern as those collected from the vehicle. But that alone wouldn't be enough to prove murder.
He had driven her car a number of times. His footprint was in an irregular place on the trunk, but it could have been there.
Police would have to physically place him at the kill site. And all they had to do that was some dirt on the bottom of Smith's shoes.
And it was our belief that if he had been standing in the area of the kill site, he would have picked up soil. It was very sandy and totally different from the mud and soil at the area where the car was pushed over.
Investigators collected soil samples from various locations where the suspect claimed to have been on the night of Susan's disappearance. They also collected samples from the spot where they believed the murder took place. All of the soil was sent to the University of Montana for analysis. There, geologist and mineralogist Jack Warenberg worked the case.
I was to examine crime scene soils, and there was a open burial site, and there were several other small areas that they wanted to be checked out to compare the soil that was present on the suspect's shoe.
Warenberg observed that the soil samples taken from the bottom of Smith's shoe contained tiny pieces of glass, probably from broken bottles. A microscopic analysis also revealed that the sample contained bits of ash that were consistent with having been produced by copper. The samples collected from Craig Smith's yard and from the path he had walked to the base had no such ash. In fact, only samples taken from the crime scene had both the tiny shards of glass and the copper ash. And the reason seemed simple. A few hundred yards from the crime scene, on the banks of the Missouri River, was the site of a copper smelting plant. Warenberg determined that it was the only area in the county where copper ash appears in the soil. Craig Smith had been at the kill site, something he had previously denied. When confronted with the evidence against him, Craig Smith admitted to killing his fiancée. He said he wanted the Galloway family business, but had no interest in being married to Susan. He was charged with first-degree murder. Based on the information, police believe that on the night of the murder, the couple got into a heated argument. Then, Craig Smith viciously attacked his fiancée. He then dragged her to a secluded spot to finish the job and bury his victim. But when that didn't work, he placed her in the trunk of her car and attempted to send the vehicle over the cliff. Craig Smith was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 100 years in prison. A patch of soil was enough for Montana police to expose a killer's dirty secret. But in Tennessee, detectives must look beyond the obvious in order to find answers to explain a mysterious death. In the early morning of December 23, 1997, Nashville police and emergency workers responded to a frantic 911 call. Terry Robinson said his wife had been violently ill for several days, and now she wasn't breathing. She was pronounced dead at the scene. With no obvious cause of death, detectives were dispatched to the home as a matter of routine.
Well,
homicide detective E.J. Bernard was assigned the case. 33-year-old Lenora Robinson lay dead on the couple's bed. Investigators noticed a black substance on the woman's shirt and on the pillowcase that seemed to have come from the victim's mouth and nose. It didn't appear to be blood. Perhaps they thought it had originated from a cigarette found next to Lenora's bed. They also found and collected a bottle of Gatorade and a glass filled with the orange liquid. Terry Robinson told the detective that Lenora had been suffering from severe flu-like symptoms for the past 4 or 5 days. In fact, the day before, Terry had taken his wife to a doctor for treatment for a high fever and uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea. The physician who examined Lenora diagnosed her with a bad case of the flu. He gave her an injection to relieve the symptoms and sent her home. Terry said that Lenora seemed better for a while, but that night her symptoms worsened. He tried to nurse her, giving her Gatorade and medications. But when he checked on her the following morning, she wasn't breathing. Though there were no signs suggesting foul play, police were troubled that someone as young as Lenora would die from the flu. Detective Bernard ordered that an autopsy be performed.
The initial assumption was that it was something to do with the flu or the shot, or possibly a heart attack, brain tumor, something totally unknown to the family members or anyone, the medical personnel on the scene.
Her body was transported to the Tennessee State Medical Examiner's office located in Nashville. There, Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Bruce Levy performed the autopsy. The thick black substance that had come from Lenora Robinson's nose immediately caught his attention.
Well, in this case, the first thing was there had been noticed some black residue on the pillow next to where her mouth had been, which means that something had come out of her body. We weren't sure exactly what it was.
An internal examination uncovered evidence of a heart condition and congested lungs, supporting the idea that Lenora had died of natural causes. Then, Detective Bernard arrived to view the autopsy. He noticed something unusual.
It smells like almonds or candy.
It does.
It was the smell of bitter almonds coming from the body. It was an odor associated with people who have died as a result of cyanide poisoning. Further examination, however, failed to turn up the telltale signs associated with cyanide ingestion. There was no liver damage and no signs of burning in the mouth or esophagus. Toxicology tests on the Gatorade found near Lenora's bed turned up negative for poison. If the 33-year-old woman had been exposed to cyanide, the question now was how and by whom. An autopsy performed on 33-year-old Lenora Robinson led authorities in Nashville, Tennessee, to believe her death had resulted from exposure to cyanide. To prove it, additional tests would have to be performed. The medical examiner collected blood, tissue, and urine samples. The items were then forwarded to forensic toxicologists. To test for the presence of poison, the samples are mixed with chemicals that react to cyanide. If the poison is present, it will turn a bluish-purple color within a few minutes. The tissue samples turned up negative. But Lenora's blood and urine tested positive for the poison. For cyanide to be absorbed in the blood, but not in the tissue, it would have had to have been inhaled. And according to forensic expert Agent Louis Kuykendall, cyanide is most lethal in a mist-like state.
Typically, the person will have convulsions, the person will have stomach distress, but usually very quickly, 30 seconds to maybe 2 minutes, they're into a coma state and then die very rapidly.
Medical examiner Bruce Levy contacted police with the findings.
It's Bruce. Yeah, I have the results on the toxicology on Lenora Robinson. It is positive for cyanide.
But until police could rule out that the poisoning was accidental or suicide, the manner of death would remain undetermined. Detective E.J. Bernard was quickly able to rule out both of those scenarios.
There was no suicide notes. I learned that she would have died within minutes of ingesting the cyanide. Therefore, she would have left something close by. There was nothing close by. Mr. Robinson assured me that he did not clean anything up.
Stormy.
Police believed Lenora Robinson had been murdered. To find out why, they questioned the victim's mother and stepfather. Both agreed that the marriage had been rocky for some time. According to Lenore's mother, the couple suffered from severe financial problems.
Pay these bills with no money in the account.
The small business that they owned and operated together was not doing well,
A credit card. You're supposed to know.
and the bills continued to pile up.
You gotta pay for it somehow.
It had caused a lot of anger and resentment between Terry and Lenora. Lenora, they said, had recently begun talking about the possibility of divorce.
I will be talking to the two of you in the next trip that they have.
They had one more piece of information to add. Terry, they said, had once worked as an exterminator, and as part of his job, he had worked with deadly poisons.
He didn't have but a couple because before they married, he had.
Before obtaining a warrant to search Terry Robinson's home, police needed to know if it was possible for him to create cyanide vapor.
You'll actually see it in some of the pesticides, industrial pesticides especially. And so
Agent Kuykendall confirmed that the process is relatively simple.
you might go ahead and collect that.
He gave police a list of items to look out for. Armed with a warrant, police returned to Terry Robinson's home. The suspect maintained his innocence. But as Detective Bernard began sifting through the couple's financial papers, he uncovered a letter Lenora had written to her husband. In it, she threatened him with a bitter and costly divorce. With a list of chemicals that could be used to transform cyanide into vapor, Detective Bernard searched the suspect's garage. There, he found several common household items that could have been used. He also collected numerous containers of unidentified liquid. At the TBI crime lab, Agent Kuykendall began analyzing the substances collected from the home. But the results were not what investigators had hoped for.
Essentially what EJ found and sent to me, none of those had cyanide or enough cyanide at any level that if someone was to ingest it or get them on, that it should harm them.
The investigation was back to square one. To make their case, police would have to rely on the circumstantial evidence. And their best bet would be to prove that the suspect had access to cyanide. Detectives contacted Terry Robinson's former employer at the extermination company where he had worked years earlier.
I need your help.
The man confirmed that while Robinson worked there, the company utilized cyanide. In fact, Terry Robinson helped convert the crystallized poison into a liquid state, which would then be administered with a mister to combat insects and rodents.
Oh, that stuff smells.
The former employer hadn't seen Terry in some time and wasn't aware of any poison he may have taken with him when he left the company.
That's all there is to it.
Sure.
Still, Detective E.J. Bernard refused to give up.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you very much. Well, I continued looking for the magic bean, we'll say, to where I could get a receipt where he bought cyanide. I was unable to locate that.
Though police had established motive and opportunity, they had no hard evidence linking Terry Robinson to the poison that was used to murder his wife. And without that, Lenora's murder threatened to remain unsolved. For forensic toxicologists in Nashville, Tennessee, had exposed the poisoning death of 33-year-old Lenora Robinson as a homicide. But so far, they had been unable to link her husband, Terry Robinson, to the cyanide gas used to kill her. But then they got the break they needed. Lenore Robinson's great-uncle came in to speak with police.
A few questions, if you don't mind. I believe your name is Roy Blanton.
He recalled that some time ago, Terry had asked for his help in killing wasps that had nested near his home.
Did he pay you for this?
Good to see you. Hi, what we got here?
The uncle agreed and came by the house to give Terry several insecticides and poisons. Among the items were cyanide tablets. Though the evidence was circumstantial at best, police were able to obtain a warrant for the arrest of Terry Robinson. On June 30th, police returned to his home and took him into custody. Terry Robinson was charged with the first-degree murder of his wife, Lenora. Based on the evidence, police believe that Terry Robinson took advantage of Lenora's illness to free himself from an unhappy marriage, heavy debt, and an impending divorce. On December 22nd, he made his way into her bedroom and administered the deadly poison. On October 15th, 1999, 49-year-old Terry Robinson was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 51 years in prison. To trap a killer and make their case, police in Nashville had to rely on both hard science and dogged determination. But some predators have an intimate knowledge of law enforcement tactics, and outwitting them can be a difficult challenge. With a population of less than 8,000 residents, Belpre, Ohio is regarded as a friendly, tight-knit community. And when someone goes missing, it's everyone's business. On September 19, 1996, Jack McCready came in to speak with Belpre police. Investigators knew him well. McCready was a respected officer with the Ohio State Police. And now he wanted to report that his wife Jennifer had disappeared. He said he last saw his wife that morning as they were getting ready to go to work. Jack said he hadn't noticed anything unusual about her behavior that morning. Though their marriage had its problems, he thought things had improved.
There you go.
Thanks.
All right, I really got to get
He later learned that Jennifer never showed up to work that day. Jack suspected his wife had been having an affair, and now he feared she had taken off with another man, leaving him with the couple's 2 children. Detective Dave Garvey agreed.
When he got home, the first thing he saw was Jennifer's wedding band on the kitchen counter. He checked the house and found out that there were certain items of hers missing, luggage was missing, and the photographs was missing.
Though police had no reason to suspect foul play, they agreed to look into the case. They began by questioning the McCready's neighbors. One believed he had seen Jennifer leaving the house that morning. Around 10 a.m., he saw Jennifer's Blazer back out of the driveway and screech down the street in an erratic manner. The neighbor admitted that he never actually saw Jennifer's face.
Okay.
But he knew the Blazer was her car, and he had never seen anyone else drive it.
All right, thank you.
Then, a few days later, police received a call that a vehicle matching Jennifer's Blazer had been located in a parking lot. Jack McCready was dispatched to the scene, and he confirmed that it was in fact his wife's car. Investigators searched the vehicle's interior. They found no obvious signs of a struggle or any indications of foul play. Still, the vehicle was impounded for a more thorough analysis. Crime scene technicians scoured the vehicle using luminol, a chemical that can detect invisible traces of blood and other biological evidence. But after hours of processing, the examination revealed nothing to suggest that a crime had taken place. As an adult, Jennifer McCready had the right to be missing. And having found no evidence that she had met with foul play, Belpre police had no choice but to give up on their search for the young mother of two. Detectives in Belpre, Ohio had found nothing to suggest that the missing wife of State Police Officer Jack McCready had met with foul play.
Yes.
All indications suggested the 30-year-old mother of two had simply packed up and left town.
The vehicle that's out there now.
But then, friends of the missing woman contacted police. They were concerned something bad had happened to Jennifer McCready. Jennifer, they said, was dedicated to her children. They were her life. No one who knew her could believe that she would just walk out on her children. And no one believed she was having an affair, as Jack McCready suggested. But Jennifer had been talking about divorcing her possessive and jealous husband. Then, a witness came forward with information. She said that around the time of Jennifer's disappearance, she saw a police vehicle driving in a remote area a few miles outside of town. The officer fit the description of Jack McCready to a T. The woman had provided unreliable information in the past, and at first, Detective Dave Garvey didn't believe this would be any different. But when no additional leads surfaced, detectives decided to drive out to the secluded spot where the woman had seen the patrol car. There, they found something that seemed out of place.
What we can do is...
It was a dirt mound. They shoveled away a few inches of dirt and hit a vinyl cloth. That was followed by the unmistakable smell of death. Crime scene technicians were quickly dispatched to the scene. As the excavation continued, the team unearthed a comforter and a sleeping bag. And wrapped inside were decomposed remains, the head covered with a white plastic trash bag. When the bag was removed, one of the officers identified the female as Jennifer McCready.
What we want to do now is...
She was wearing pajamas. That was at odds with her husband's claim that when he last saw her, she was dressed and leaving for work. As a matter of routine, soil samples were collected from the makeshift grave. Technicians collected the bedding and the sleeping bag for a more detailed analysis. The victim was transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. The medical examiner determined that Jennifer McCready had died as a result of a gunshot wound to her head. the fatal .357 Magnum bullet was collected and sent to the crime lab. Belpre investigators now had a homicide on their hands. The inconsistent information, in addition to witness testimony, pointed to State Police Officer Jack McCready as the prime suspect.
I've got some bad news for you, Jack.
Detectives arranged to speak with him at the barracks where he was stationed.
You understand?
When they broke the news about Jennifer's death, he was visibly shaken.
You guys as a family, at this point.
But as they began to
I think
question
it'd
him,
be best,
McCready asked for an attorney and ended the interview. Soon after, Jack McCready was put on leave. Investigators hoped the forensic evidence could tell them more. All of the items collected from the crime scene were sent to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Apprehension Lab for analysis. While processing the evidence, criminalist Michelle Yezzo discovered dozens of synthetic fibers. She also located strands of fiberglass clinging to the inside of the sleeping bag.
Finding the fiberglass insulation within that sleeping bag was something that was very unusual in my opinion, because that would be very itchy. And because of that, that's not something that you would want to have in that sort of context.
Police obtained a warrant to search the McCready home.
Let you look it over. Take a look at it.
In the bedroom, they found linens that matched the comforter the victim had been buried in. Several fibers were also collected for comparison with those recovered from the crime scene. In the kitchen, police located a .357 Magnum revolver, the same type of gun used to kill Jennifer McCready. As the search continued, investigators found and collected newly installed fiberglass insulation in the couple's garage. The material appeared identical to the insulation found in the sleeping bag. Then they noticed another potential clue. There were numerous shovels, and some were coated with dirt. Though McCready explained that he had recently done work on his yard, police confiscated the tools. Now, forensic examiners began analyzing all of the evidence. Michelle Yezzo found that the carpet fibers collected from the McCready home shared all the same microscopic characteristics as those recovered from the bedding that the victim had been buried in. All of the evidence suggested the victim was murdered in her own home. But none of it told them who had carried out the homicide. And their best chance of linking Jack McCready to the murder turned out to be a dead end. The gun barrel had been bored out, making ballistic comparisons nearly impossible. Police had underestimated Jack McCready.
I don't see anything in there that says that it was...
The suspect had been clever enough to tamper with the one piece of evidence that could directly tie him to the murder. Or so he thought. Police contacted Richard Bisbing, a forensic microscopist with the private firm of Macrone Associates. He was asked to compare soil samples that were collected from the gravesite, Jack McCready's shovel, and from the suspect's yard.
We analyze soil samples by doing a side-by-side careful comparison of all the details that we can find in the soil itself. The soil differs by color and by the presence of plant material. It differs by its mineral content. It differs by its texture, the particle sizes in the soil grains themselves. And all of those features are compared.
Bisbing began his analysis by comparing the soil taken from McCrady's shovel to samples taken from his yard. But the texture, size, color, and mineral composition of the two samples did not match. But when he compared the soil from the gravesite with the soil taken from the shovel, he found one consistency after another.
We could conclude that the soil from the shovel was similar to the gravesite and could have originated from the gravesite. And we were able to show that the place of the gravesite was different in its soil classification even from the place where the defendant lived, and the soil was different than most places in the county.
A short while later, Ohio State Police Officer Jack McCrady was placed under arrest and charged with the murder of his wife, Jennifer.
1025.
Though police remain unsure what drove him to murder, the evidence suggests that on the evening of September 18th, Jack McCrady shot Jennifer one time in the head. To cover up his actions, he buried her in a remote spot, returned home, and altered the barrel of his gun. Despite his efforts, Jack McCrady was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Some killers will go to extraordinary lengths to distance themselves from their deeds. But no crime is perfect. And sometimes, investigators must rely on a few molecules in order to piece together the elements of murder. In rural Michigan, a search for a missing man ends in cold-blooded murder. Investigators call on a team of forensic scientists to establish the victim's time of death and bring his killer to justice. In Salinas, California, a couple finds a skeleton in a shallow grave under their house. A missing persons report, filed 14 years earlier, may have covered up a murder. Bones of lost victims may lie hidden for years. Time and the elements can destroy evidence. When those remains are finally discovered, the deceased have a chance to speak, and the tales they tell reveal grave secrets. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. The quiet agricultural town of Salinas, California, is known for its abundant produce. A town of hard-working people, it hardly seems the place for a murder. But on January 14th, 1998, the owners of a house discovered something that would change that impression forever. Jim Olson told his wife Sandra and her sister that he discovered something strange in the crawl space under the house while installing heating ducts.
I just happened to look over and there's like a pair of shoes.
He found a pair of tennis shoes sticking out of the dirt, with the toes pointing upwards.
I'm not joking.
I want to see it.
Sure.
That's creepy.
He was too large to reach them in the cramped space. To Jim, it looked as if someone may have been buried in a shallow grave.
I just got out of there. I didn't want to see.
I want to see it.
They all hoped it was a prank.
They're directly back there, right under the kitchen.
We can't just leave them down there. It's creepy.
Yeah, we can.
You know what? I'll go.
But Sandra volunteered to check, just to make sure.
Be careful.
here?
Straight back towards the kitchen. See it?
Something was holding the shoes firmly in place.
It's stuck on something.
In the dim light, Sandra could see that the shoes were attached to a skeleton. Jim called 911. Officers from the Salinas Police Department responded to the call. Sergeant Miller and Detective McLaughlin were among the responding officers. Police confirmed that the bones were human, and the area was declared a crime scene.
Right, Dr. Galloway, as you can see, this is exactly how we found it.
To properly preserve the site and recover the skeletal remains, investigators called in Dr. Allison Galloway, a forensic anthropologist at the University of California, Santa Cruz campus. Remarkably, Galloway found the skeleton to be complete and undisturbed by animals. The initial examination determined that the bones were likely male and that they had been there for a number of years.
We could tell that the body had been there for quite a while. There was no odor, there was no grease in the bone, there was no soft tissue left. So we say usually that takes about 5 years minimum, but it then can go anywhere up to 50 years. So we have quite a long range. We did see a lot of exfoliation of the bone. The bone itself wasn't disintegrating, but it was in a very protected environment.
Decomposed jeans and underwear suggested the victim had been fully clothed at the time of his death and burial. As Galloway carefully sifted through the remains, she found a .38 caliber bullet. Police now believed they had uncovered a homicide. As they scoured the area around the body, they uncovered some personal items, including a set of keys and a cigarette lighter. Sergeant Miller of the Salinas Police Department spoke with the family that currently owned the house.
A couple of real quick questions. Just pretty much the basics as far as when did you buy the house here?
They said that they had lived there for 2.5 years.
And I got the story just real quick. Let me just run it by and see if I got everything straight.
This was the first time anyone had been in the crawl space.
Push it over.
Now, investigators had to determine who this victim was. Without the victim's identity, police would not be able to track his killer.
I was surprised at how specific they are. I mean, this one's in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
The remains were sent to the UC Santa Cruz Anthropology Lab. There, they believed Dr. Galloway could provide vital information.
I'll get the bone board so we can do stature.
Okay. I'm going to go with the right femur.
Measurements confirmed that the remains were that of an adolescent male of European descent.
Okay,
He was approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall.
To 5'10".
Okay.
Okay.
The bullet found among the remains indicated the victim had been shot.
The gladiolus and the xiphoid. On the sternal bodies.
To verify the cause of death, Dr. Galloway looked for any peculiarities on the bones.
Well, let's take a look at the skull here.
She discovered 2 gunshot holes in the victim's skull.
So, it looks like we have 2 entry wounds over here. This victim, we had a whole series of injuries. We had 2 gunshot injuries to the head and at least 1 and possibly 2 gunshot injuries to the rest of the body. The first of the head ones came in on the right side, sort of around the ear, and probably exited through the left eye. And then the second injury came in a little bit further forward, and that moved and came out on this side over here.
There was also evidence of at least 1 entry wound to the victim's back.
And rib 7, we also have some breaking. Perimortem, this is around death.
Dr. Galloway reported her findings to Sergeant Miller.
Okay, doctor, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
He cross-referenced the address where the victim was found with missing persons reports dating back from 5 years earlier. He came up with a promising match. A teenage boy named Chris DeNoyer was reported missing from the same residence in 1984. Sergeant Miller reviewed the report. There was a picture on file, and Dr. Galloway's assessment was consistent with the missing boy's description.
Chris DeNoyer was last seen January 13th, 1984, and it was his mother who had notified police that, in fact, her son was missing at that time.
Investigators obtained Chris's dental records. Dr. Kevin Landon performed the analysis. He compared the x-rays from Chris's file to slides of the victim's dental remains. He noticed something.
I found that there was a retainer, an orthodontic type retainer on the lower jaw extending from his left canine tooth to his right canine tooth with an orthodontic band around it. During the time that this individual was alive, that was a standard type of orthodontic retainer to place. Nowadays they are made a little different, bonded in the back of the teeth so that they're not so visible.
Dr. Landon had found a positive match.
I concluded that the dental remains from this individual under the house matched the dental records that I received.
Investigators finally had a name and a face for their victim. Now they needed to find out who had murdered Chris DeNoyer. But after 14 years, the killer's trail was cold. Little evidence remained. Police were uncertain they would ever solve this case. Police in Salinas, California struggled to track the killer of Chris DeNoyer, whose body was found 14 years after he was reported missing. A .38 caliber bullet was the only evidence the killer left behind. Investigators now needed to reconstruct the events that led up to his death. First, they wanted to make sure there was no access to the crawl space from the outside of the house. They found none.
There's only one way in and one way out. So the 2 possible scenarios are either it's a stranger or it's somebody that lives in the residence. Now, if you try to play out the stranger scenario, you'd have to say the stranger came into the house, murdered Chris, and then hoped that they would have enough time to drag this body into their house, dig a grave, cover it over, and crawl out before anyone comes home.
And that didn't seem likely to the police.
In my mind, the people that were suspects in this case were anyone that had access and control to the residence in January of 1984.
And the only access was from inside.
You know, I'm not sure.
But Sergeant Miller wanted to be certain that Chris hadn't been murdered after he went missing. He made another call to Dr. Kevin Landon.
One of the questions that Detective Andy Miller of the Salinas Police Department asked of me was that would it have been possible for Christopher to have actually run away, returned a few years later, possibly been murdered by someone and placed under the house? And I could tell him that that was impossible due to the fact that his wisdom teeth had not developed any further.
It was proof that Chris was murdered just before the missing persons report was filed.
Thank you very much.
The police report indicated that Chris had a girlfriend at the time of his disappearance. They hoped she could give some insight into the family.
So she was the first person that we decided to contact, primarily because since she didn't live in the house, she wasn't as likely in our eyes to be a suspect.
She was dismayed to hear the news of Chris's death. She stated she first met Chris Denoyer in 1983. They dated up until his disappearance in '84. Chris, she said, was her first love. When asked about Chris's relationship with his parents, she said that Chris and his stepfather, Jackson Villarta, constantly fought. Villarta was always on him about something. She said she never believed Chris ran away. He wouldn't have left without saying goodbye to her.
Hi, Mrs. Villarta. Detective Miller from Salinas PD. We talked on the phone.
Come in.
Thank you.
Investigators decided it was time to speak with Chris's mother.
This is about your son, Christopher Denoyer.
Have you found him?
They tracked her down at her current residence.
And I'm so
She was
sorry.
shocked by the news that Chris's body had been found.
It's very important that we begin our investigation and try to find
On the day Chris disappeared, she was at work. Her husband, Jackson Villarta, called her and told her that Chris had run away. She had been convinced he was still alive. In fact, they had received a telegram from him a few days after he disappeared. Chris, she said, was an average teenager, but they had their problems with him. He and his sister were having trouble adjusting to life with her new husband, Jackson Villarta. Investigators asked if anyone in the family owned a gun. She said that Jackson Villarta had one for home security, but she didn't know the kind. Miller didn't believe that Chris's mother had anything to do with the murder.
At the time of this murder, Chris's mother was pregnant, and she's a heavy-set woman to begin with, so the idea of her going through this very small crawl space and digging, a 6-foot trench into her house and dragging a 180-pound victim under there, that's pretty much out of the question.
But they did have a suspect in mind. Chris's stepfather, Jackson Villarta.
Specific there, and you can see from the crime scene sketch here that this body. We felt that the only person that could possibly benefit from burying a body underneath a residence was the person who was in control of that residence, and in this case, that's Jackson Villarta.
Villarta worked for the telephone company. They found him on his route.
Excuse me, Mr. Villarta. How are you, sir?
As investigators approached, they noticed he had the right size and build to dig the 6-foot trench in the crawl space.
We're from Salinas PD.
Mr. Villarta, I already talked to your supervisor.
He agreed to accompany them in for questioning. He was cooperative and admitted that he and Chris had had their troubles. But he said that was normal. Teenagers often have conflicts with their step-parents.
One other thing I'd like to explain to you. A lot of times when people come down to the police department.
Villarta said he worked from noon to 8 p.m. on the day Chris disappeared. When he got home, his wife told him that Chris had run away.
This is Detective
Colt Python.
His story contradicted what his wife had told investigators earlier.
22 rifle. Anything else?
A few days later, he said, they received a mailgram from Chris saying he was sorry for all the trouble he had caused and that he had moved out. Investigators were suspicious. Viarta admitted that he had 2 guns, a .22 caliber rifle and a .38 caliber revolver. The caliber of the handgun interested Sergeant Miller.
The rounds we'd found in the grave, that Chris had been murdered with a .38 caliber weapon. So it was a very significant piece of information.
The police needed to get a search warrant to examine the revolver. They went to Viarta's house to prevent him from entering and removing the handgun. With a warrant in hand, police searched the home where Viarta now lived. They collected the .38 caliber revolver and some ammunition. While they waited for the ballistics testing to be completed, they checked out Viarta's story. They secured all of his personal records for January of 1984.
So we've got to look at this. We've got a call.
There was one small detail that piqued their interest.
We've got a call at 1. Look at this. Hey, Bob. Yeah. Come here and take a look at this.
The mailgram that was supposedly sent by Chris 3 days after he disappeared was ordered from and billed to Viarta's home phone.
So this is dynamite. Right. But we've got to find
Chris had already been murdered.
Who's calling these numbers?
Police knew that Viarta had written it.
So there was definitely somebody home. The one sentence in the mailgram that completely gave it away that Jackson was the author was when the statement was that in some ways Jackson was right. And you're talking about a 16-year-old kid who hated his stepfather. Is he going to write in this letter that he thinks that his stepfather was right? The only person that would write that was Jackson. So the whole idea of the mailgram right from the beginning was preposterous. 84.
The circumstantial evidence against Jackson Viarta was mounting.
The house on Navajo Drive.
But investigators would need one more piece of evidence to make an arrest. Detectives in Salinas, California had identified Jackson Viarta as the prime suspect in the murder of his teenage stepson, Chris Denoyer. But they still needed physical evidence to link him to the scene of the crime. A .38 caliber revolver and ammunition were collected during a search of his house. Scott Armstrong, senior criminalist with the California State Department of Justice, examined the gun. He fired the weapon into a water tank. And collected the spent bullets.
The gun, whether it's a revolver or a pistol, will have 2 kinds of markings that they impress on the bullet: class characteristics and individual characteristics. The class characteristics would be things that would be common to all guns of that make and manufacture.
The individual characteristics are unique markings called lands and grooves, which are left on a bullet as it travels through the gun barrel. They are as individual as fingerprints. Using a comparison microscope, he compared the bullets from the crime scene to the bullets fired from Viarta's weapon side by side. The bullets matched.
There were class markings and individual markings that were sufficient that I could identify the bullet as having been fired from the revolver.
It was the hard evidence investigators needed.
Mr. Viarta, with your left hand, slowly reach out and open the door from the outside. Slowly step out of the vehicle and face away from me. Take 2 steps to your left. Stop. Put your hands behind your back and interlace your fingers. Get down on your knees.
On February 6, 1999, Jackson Viarta was arrested for the murder of Chris DeNoyer 15 years earlier. Under questioning, he denied all charges and maintained his innocence. At trial, investigators presented a videotape that proved it wasn't likely an outsider broke into the home, killed Chris, and then buried him in the crawl space. An officer matching Viarta's physical description dug a hole in the confined area. The experiment was timed. It took a little over an hour.
So getting back to the fact that if an outsider had come into this place, done the murder, and decided this was how he was going to dispose of the body, he would have had to commit himself to a minimum of 1 hour in sort of the danger zone, because if someone had come home while he was there, they would have been discovered.
Based on the evidence, investigators believe Jackson Viarta and Chris argued that day.
You're going to give me that respect. Yes, you are.
Not my father.
You're going to give me that respect. Like it or not.
In a rage, Viarta grabbed his .38 caliber gun and shot Chris twice in the head and once in the chest. Then he hid his body in the crawl space under the house.
Get over here.
On February 1st, 2000, Jackson Viarta was convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 17 years to life. Jackson Viarta thought that burying his victim under the house would permanently conceal the evidence of his crime. But some killers believe time and the elements will erase the evidence for them. In June 1995, the Lansing Police Department in Michigan was working a difficult case. Detective Jay Trost led the investigation.
Got a missing person, has been missing quite some time. We're looking, I got a photo of here I'm going to pass out, see if anyone here can locate this guy or if everyone else.
29-year-old Mark Bosom had vanished.
Anyone got any questions on him or anything like that?
Do you know if he's supposed to be armed with any type of...
Well, we believe he's more of a victim. We don't suspect he'd be armed, but you never know, so be careful. At this point, I wouldn't really consider it.
Mark's wife, Cindy, reported him missing 3 weeks earlier.
For him, if you find anything about him, anyone that knows him, any information you might think is pertinent, just give me a call or leave me a message and I'll get back with you. He's been missing for...
The longer Mark was missing, the more Detective Trost suspected foul play. He needed to find out if anyone had seen him or knew of his whereabouts. Officers were sent to interview his relatives, friends, and acquaintances. They learned that the day before Mark disappeared, he cashed his income tax check and was paid from his job. But dozens of interviews turned up nothing else. The police could find no one who'd heard from him since his disappearance.
He wasn't seen anywhere, couldn't find anyone that had any kind of contact. We couldn't even find anyone that had even seen him or could remember seeing him, anything like that. So he just like vanished.
Sergeant Mark Murray was eager to speak with Mark Bosom's wife, Cindy, the last person known to have seen him. She admitted to him that she and her husband had their problems and were separated as a result, but claimed that both of them wanted to save the marriage.
She appeared to me to be a very loving and caring mother. She and Mark had had a daughter, and she seemed to be trying to keep the family together. So they were trying to iron out their differences and get things worked out and patched up.
She told the sergeant that a few nights before his disappearance, Mark visited her at the bowling alley where she worked as a waitress. When he arrived, a man named Tom Hart was talking to her. Mark was uncomfortable with Hart and believed that he was interested in more than just a friendship with his wife. According to Cindy, Hart was infatuated with her. She told Sergeant Murray that on several occasions she noticed Hart following her after work. In fact, her husband insisted that she take out a restraining order against him. But Cindy considered Hart a friend and couldn't believe that he had anything to do with Mark's disappearance. Sergeant Murray wasn't so sure.
Hey guys, how's it going? What I thought was that led a little more credibility to the fact that some foul play could have been involved in his gone missing, as opposed to him just leaving on his own.
Investigators decided to take a closer look at Tom Hart. When questioned by investigators, Hart was cooperative. The 52-year-old claimed that he and Cindy Bosom had more than a friendly relationship. He said that Cindy was planning on divorcing her estranged husband and moving in with him, but was apprehensive about telling Mark. Hart admitted that the last time he saw Mark was the night before he disappeared. He had met with him in person to inform him of their intentions. While Mark wasn't happy about this news, the conversation ended cordially. In fact, he had asked Hart for a ride to a nearby convenience store. Hart agreed and dropped him off. As Mark walked toward the store, he approached two men who were standing outside. He seemed to know them. When Hart asked if he wanted a ride back, Mark declined, saying he'd get one later. That was the last time he saw him. Police asked if he would be willing to take a polygraph test. Though he insisted he had nothing to hide, Hart refused, claiming he had no idea where Mark Bosom was. Investigators didn't believe him.
By his tone and his mannerisms and his basically, it's not that he wouldn't answer questions, but he was very evasive in his answers. He wasn't real forthcoming with a lot of information. We had to pry everything out of him. He would give you an answer to a question, but he never gave you any meat.
Investigators knew Hart was covering up for something. And there was still no evidence of a crime. Police in Lansing, Michigan worked to solve the missing persons case of 29-year-old Mark Bosom. Tom Hart, the last person to see him the night he disappeared, said he dropped Mark off at a convenience store. Investigators doubted his story. They contacted the manager of the convenience store to see if there was a surveillance camera in the parking lot. There wasn't one. And no one remembered seeing either man that night. With no evidence of a crime and only their suspicions that Tom Hart was involved in Mark's disappearance, investigators met to discuss their next move.
had it analyzed or looked at. And said,
The investigation was going nowhere. But then they caught a break.
At that point, there was some information that Tom Hart owned a farm. Well, from the time that Mark Bosom came up missing to like within a week and a half, Tom Hart decided to till up his land.
If Hart was involved in Mark Bosom's disappearance, it was also likely he would hide the evidence.
He could have taken him out to the farm and disposed of the body and tilled him up in the soil.
With the assistance of the Michigan State Police, Sergeant Murray conducted an air reconnaissance of Tom Hart's farm.
We were looking for where the ground had been tilled up and disturbed. Maybe a grave had been dug, that the furrows would be different in the ground.
It was a promising lead, but after hours of searching, there was no evidence of a burial or a recent grave. Without a search warrant, all investigators could do was wait.
After approximately a month, there was nothing. And on a missing case like this, it starts to go cold. There wasn't a whole lot more that could be done. What we needed to do is either find him alive or dead, and then go from there. We were unable to find anything.
The investigation had hit a dead end. Trost had been down this road before and knew that someday a clue would turn up. He just had to be patient. Almost a year and a half later, in nearby Shiawassee County, a man walking his dog made a terrible discovery.
Oh my God.
Hidden among some brush lay a human skull. He called the police. Detective Trost and crime scene technicians from the Lansing Police Department responded. Investigators hoped this was the lead they had been waiting for. Until now, they had a suspect, but no hard evidence of a crime. They collected the decomposed skull, then carefully searched the area.
How long ago would you say you got here? How long has it been?
Nearby, they recovered articles of clothing, a blood-stained blanket, and more human remains. They also found a spent .22 caliber bullet casing. From the level of decomposition, vines that had grown through the tattered clothing, and some insect larvae, they determined that the body had been there for some time. But their search of the area yielded no clues to the victim's identity. Investigators forwarded the skeletal remains to Michigan State University for analysis.
Would you agree that's a male characteristic, Mike?
There, forensic anthropologist Dr. Norman Sauer looked to the bones to help establish the person's identity.
Border of the eye orbit right along here.
After analyzing the shape and dimension of brow ridges on the skull, Dr. Sauer concluded that the victim was male, likely in his late 20s to early 30s. From the measurements of the femur, he determined the individual stood between 5 feet 6 inches and 5 feet 9 inches tall. He also discovered marks on one of the vertebrae, evidence that this victim had been shot in the chest.
Our conclusion was that this was probably a homicide.
David 314 to Central.
But detectives couldn't be certain that this victim was the long-missing Mark Bosom. The physical description roughly matched Bosom's, but it also matched countless other missing persons. To catch the killer and determine who the victim was, investigators would have to find a way to pinpoint exactly when this victim died.
Not too bad. Just getting some dental records. Oh, it is frustrating, very frustrating. At this point, there's no way for us to say for sure who this person is.
The victim's clothing and the blanket recovered from the crime scene were sent to forensic entomologist Dr. Richard Merritt. As an expert in insect growth and development, Dr. Merritt analyzes the life cycles of bugs found on a corpse and estimates how much time has elapsed since a person's death.
The time of death can be determined using the life cycle of an insect. So basically when someone dies, the insects are attracted immediately to the body within hours.
Dr. Merritt began by identifying each of the species found on the shirt and blanket. Among the various insects present, Dr. Merritt observed an adult parasitic wasp. Though other insects are attracted to a corpse within 24 hours of death, research has shown that wasps will not appear and lay their eggs for several months. Then it takes time for the wasp larvae to hatch and mature into adults. Adding in the wasp's maturation process, Dr. Merritt narrowed down this victim's time of death.
The entomological findings showed that this body had been around from 4 to 8 months, maybe longer, since the person died.
Dr. Merritt's findings held promise. This victim hadn't been killed recently. Forensic botanist Dr. Frank Ewers analyzed the grapevines found growing through the victim's clothing. By examining the internal structure of the wood stems, Dr. Ewers was able to calculate the age of the vine.
Here you can see a growth ring. From this, we can tell that there was quite a lot of growth the previous year. So that meant that it had to be at least 15 months old. And so it told us that the body had to be there at least 15 months.
I haven't got any new information from anybody.
It was the break investigators were waiting for. Cindy Bosom put them in touch with Mark's dentist.
Statements here, what the people had said at the party store.
His dental records were sent to anthropologist Dr. Norman Sauer. Dr. Sauer compared Mark's dental x-rays with the post-mortem x-rays taken from the victim's remains.
Once the police had an idea who the remains belonged to, they went to that person's dentist and were able to get a hold of dental records and dental x-rays. And that allowed us to do a side-by-side comparison and positively identify the remains as those of Mark Allen Bosom.
With the help of forensic examiners, police had finally identified the victim. Now they needed to tie Tom Hart to the crime. Looking for answers, they began questioning all known associates of the suspect.
And then let me know what happens.
Will do.
An acquaintance of Hart's told police that Hart owned a .22 caliber gun. In fact, he and Hart had used such a gun for target practice prior to Mark Bosom's disappearance.
You show me how it's done.
Okay, I will. Now, just watch the old timer. I'll show you how it's done. Okay, great. See you.
The information was enough to get a warrant to search Hart's property. Investigators paid particular attention to Tom Hart's gun collection. They recovered a Winchester Model 94 and a Remington 16-gauge shotgun. Detective Jay Trost knew that neither gun was of the caliber used in the homicide.
I was looking for a 22 handgun, something like that. I did collect some rifles. I didn't really, in my heart, believe that they were involved, but you got to collect everything, and sometimes stories change. So we took what we could find, but there wasn't much there.
18 months after Mark Bosom's murder, investigators had a suspect, but still no evidence against him. In Lansing, Michigan, police were investigating the murder of Mark Bosom. Their suspect, Thomas Hart, was obsessed with Mark's estranged wife. Police had a motive, but no evidence. A search of his property turned up nothing. Investigators learned that the vehicle Hart drove at the time of Mark Bosom's disappearance was parked outside his work. They impounded it for a closer inspection.
Tom, Detective Murray, you remember me? Here's a search warrant. We're taking your vehicle in for processing.
Although the car had been thoroughly cleaned, they detected trace amounts of blood.
When we went through it, we were able to determine with luminol that there was actually blood on the passenger seat.
And that wasn't all. When they cut the seat open, they discovered that the cushion below was covered with dried blood.
It had been there a year and a half, and it was degraded. I mean, it smelled like degraded blood. When you looked down, I went, whoa. I was expecting little trace amounts of blood. There was like a big puddle of dried blood. So with that was very, very good and exciting evidence for me, because now with this blood, we got somewhere to go. We can figure out whose blood it is. I am assuming at this time that it's probably Mark Bosom's blood. Now I got to figure out how to get that analyzed.
Investigators knew that if both parents were alive, a DNA match could be established.
I knew that the mother was alive. I called her, and she was able to tell me that the father wasn't back alive. So we actually drew blood from both those people. It was turned over to the crime lab along with the evidence they had at the scene, and they were able to analyze that and hopefully get DNA.
They were in luck. It was a match.
The blood in the car matches both parents' blood, which in turn is Mark Bosom blood. So now we got an exact match. And in my mind right now, we got enough probably to get an arrest warrant for murder.
Police finally had the evidence they needed to arrest Tom Hart. But Hart was hiding out at his farm. Because of his violent history, they didn't want to rush the house. And it was only a matter of time before he came out. Police watched and waited.
He was pretty much aware that there was a warrant out for him by now, and he was hiding out.
Looks like he's going to the barn.
He actually walked out, got in the vehicle, and left, and he didn't even go out on the road. I'm guessing if he didn't go out on the road, maybe he thought the police weren't going to get him. But he drove through the field. When they saw that, they just swooped in on him.
Keep your hands where we can see them. Put your hands on top of your head. Turn and face the female officer. Now walk backwards towards me. Walk backwards towards me. That's it. Keep walking. Keep walking. Get to the corner of the car and stop.
He was arrested for the first-degree murder of Mark Bosom.
Tom, we have a warrant for your arrest.
Hey, have a seat, please.
At the police department, Tom Hart was informed of his rights.
You understand you've been arrested for first-degree murder. Before we get into that, I'll talk to you about that.
He refused to answer any questions and demanded his attorney.
We'll get your attorney. We're ready. We can get someone to come in here. Ready, you can take him down to the jail. Ready to
right there against the window.
He was placed in the Lansing County Jail to await trial.
Take him downtown.
When it became clear that Cindy Bosom only wanted to be friends, a jealous heart confronted Mark Bosom. He lured him into his car. Then he drove Mark Bosom to a deserted area where he shot the unsuspecting victim in the neck. Hart disposed of the body, believing that no one would find it. On January 9, 1998, Thomas Hart was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Some killers believe they can get away with murder. Hiding a body may seem like the best plan, but even when many years have passed and only bones remain, forensic science can find the truth and uncover grave secrets.